50 years after childhood's stand, Ruby Bridges still works for change. Written by Lottie L. Joyner. The little black girl in the 1963 Norman Rockwell painting walks confidently, books in hand, surrounded by 4 men in uniform. The girl was 6-year-old Ruby Bridges, and the men in uniform were federal marshals who were there to protect her from an angry mob. The painting, titled "The Problem We All Live With," was a symbol of the fight for civil rights and the struggle to desegregate America's public schools. Though the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled separate but equal schools unconstitutional in the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, 6 years later, the nation was still grappling with the implications of black and white children attending school together. Louisiana, like many other southern states, used a number of legal stalling tactics until they were forced to integrate. Bridges was among the first African American children to desegregate elementary schools in the South, and on November 14, 1960, she became the first to enter William Frantz Public School in New Orleans' Ninth Ward. Her solitary courage broke down the barriers of people who knew racism was wrong but wouldn't do anything about it, said Taylor Branch, author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Parting the Waters, America in the King Years, 1954 to 1963. Today, 50 years after that historic event, Ruby Bridges is still fighting for equal education, working through her foundation to establish a charter school for history at William Frantz. I believe that history should be taught in a different way. History definitely should be taught the way it happened. Good, bad, or ugly, said Bridges. History is sacred. For me, history is a foundation and the truth. Breaking barriers. In the spring of 1960, New Orleans had run out of ways to keep black children from attending school with whites. With no choice left, the school board decided to test black students to determine who would be eligible to attend the city's white schools. Bridges, who was in kindergarten, was one of only a handful of African American students who passed the test. The NAACP convinced Bridges' parents to allow her to attend the all-white school near their home. My father was initially against it, remembers Bridges. My father fought in the Korean War and felt like even on the battlefield, he was just a colored soldier. He thought things would never change, so why subject a child to this kind of behavior? Bridges' mother, however, persisted. My mother felt like it was an opportunity for her children to have a better education, said Bridges. But it would not be easy. The backlash against integration was so intense that Federal District Court Judge James Skelly Wright requested federal marshals be sent to New Orleans to protect students. When Ruby and her mother arrived at William Frantz that November day, there were protesters carrying signs, yelling insults, and throwing things. According to Bridges' memoir, Through My Eyes, the marshals told them to just walk straight ahead and don't look back. But little Ruby couldn't help noticing the tiny black doll in a coffin. I remember the first day being escorted by federal marshals and being rushed inside of a school that soon became empty because parents went in and removed their children from the school, said Bridges, now Ruby Bridges Hall. The marshals, 2 in front, 2 behind, escorted Ruby and her mother to the principal's office, where they stayed the entire first day of school. It would be the beginning of a long, lonely year. The year alone. The following days at William Frantz mirrored the first. The crowd in front of the building shouted racial epithets as Ruby arrived to school escorted by federal marshals each day. The atmosphere inside wasn't that much better. None of the teachers wanted Ruby in their classroom. A new young teacher from Boston, Barbara Henry, agreed to teach the black first grader. And so there they were, Ruby and Mrs. Henry. They spent the whole year together, just the two of them. It was a year of isolation for the young student. Initially, Ruby had to eat her lunch alone in the classroom because someone had threatened to poison her. She was not allowed to go in the cafeteria, so Mrs. Henry eventually joined her for lunch. She was not allowed to go outside for recess either, and she had to be escorted to the bathroom by a federal marshal. Though Ruby showed a brave face, the isolation did affect her. She had trouble sleeping and at one time refused to eat the lunch her mother packed because she longed to be in the cafeteria where she believed there were other children. A few white students returned to William Frantz toward the end of the year, and Ruby was allowed to play with them. In her book, she detailed how she learned about racism then. The light dawned one day when a little boy refused to play with me, Bridges wrote in her memoir. "I can't play with you," the boy said. "My mama said not to because you're a nigger." That year also took a toll on the Bridges' family. Her father lost his job and her grandparents, who were Mississippi sharecroppers, were thrown off their land. But little Ruby continued to go to school. "I never missed a day that whole year," said Bridges. "The year would have been impossible if it wasn't for Mrs. Henry," said Bridges. "She absolutely made school fun. She looked exactly like all of the protesters outside, but she was one of the nicest teachers I ever had." Her story, our history. The next year, the white students returned to William Frantz and Ruby's second grade classroom was integrated. But it would be years before she realized the impact she had on the civil rights movement. "It was done over and swept under the rug. Nobody talked about it," said Bridges about her history-making year. "The matter wasn't even discussed in the Bridges household," she said, "but already frail relationships would be torn apart by it." Her parents separated by the time she was in the 7th grade, leaving Bridges and her siblings to be raised by her mother. By the time she was 18, Bridges wanted to know more about the events that took place at William Frantz. "I found myself on a quest to find out who I really was and find out as much as I could about what had happened," said Bridges. "I really wanted to know about that part of history because it was my history. It was my life story." Branch says Bridges' story demonstrated that it took more than just lawyers and court rulings for change to happen in the civil rights movement. Those in the fight for justice realized that you have to have sacrifice and witness and courage on top of that. People realized that this was a smart, courageous, dignified young lady who was a lot braver than most of the rest of the country. And by that witness, she made it harder for people to say, "That's not my problem," said Branch. That really was a very, very powerful role. Back where it all began. After high school, Bridges became a travel agent, but she longed for a purpose. It was after her brother's death in 1990 that her life's purpose began to take shape. She took in his 4 daughters, who just happened to attend the school Bridges had desegregated 30 years earlier. Bridges began to realize her passion to reach young people as she worked as a volunteer at her former school. In 1995, child psychiatrist Robert Coles, who worked with Bridges during her year at William Frantz, wrote the book, The Story of Ruby Bridges. Soon after, Disney made a movie about her experience. The events inspired Bridges to create the Ruby Bridges Foundation in 1999, which teaches youth about tolerance and respect. Racism is something that is passed on to our kids. That's something we as adults pass on. That's why we're still dealing with the issue of race today, said Bridges. Since racism is something that is passed down to our children, if we are to change that, then that's where we need to start. I'm trying to catch it before it starts and hopefully turn that around by educating our kids. In 2005, one of Bridges' 4 sons was violently killed in New Orleans. She's hoping that the work she does today will help change the environment that contributed to his death. We are losing so many young black males. I believe we have to come together to turn that around. We have to get back to taking care of one another, rebuilding our families, and teaching those values we lost some 50 years ago, said Bridges. We can do that through communities. For me, I really do believe that the key is education. As a result, Bridges has been working to turn William France, which was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, into the Ruby Bridges School for Community Service and Social Justice. Bridges hopes to create an environment where students of all backgrounds can come together, learn, and grow to respect each other's differences, something she learned working with Mrs. Henry 50 years ago. I believe that my life's work was shaped for me through that experience, said Bridges. She taught me what Dr. King tried to teach all of us. We should never judge a person by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That was the lesson I learned at 6 years old.